Hello and welcome. My name is Simon Pont, Director of Quality Systems and Practice at Suicide Prevention Australia. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the webinar, Ethical Issues in Designing Suicide Prevention Studies. I would like to firstly acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. I'm coming to you from the land of the Awabakal people here in Lake Macquarie, Newcastle. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. You may also like to acknowledge in the chat the country you are joining us from. I would also like to acknowledge the voice of the experience as we discuss this topic and research more generally. It's vitally important that our research is co-created with people who have a lived and living experience of suicide. People with a lived experience are well placed to inform, influence, and enhance our knowledge of what works in suicide prevention. Today, we acknowledge all people impacted by suicide. We acknowledge the life lost to suicide and acknowledge the suffering that suicide brings to our lives when it touches. At Suicide Prevention, we're delighted to host this webinar with our colleagues and in collaboration with the University of Melbourne. As you may be aware, Suicide Prevention Australia is the national peak body for suicide prevention sector. We exist to provide a clear collective voice for suicide prevention so that together we can save lives. And one of our main activities in the research space is through the National Suicide Prevention Research Fund. For today's webinar, we have an outstanding range of speakers and panelists. First up, we have Dr. Carl Andreasen, who will provide an overview of research undertaken at the Centre for Mental Health and highlighting the recommendations from the expert consensus study. Following this, we have a panel discussion facilitated by Professor Jane Perkins, Director, Centre for Mental Health, University of Melbourne. If you'd like to read more about the speakers and the panelists today, their detailed bios has been emailed out to you. And before I hand over to Carl, a little housekeeping. You can write your questions in the chat at any time throughout the sessions, throughout the webinar, and they'll be saved for the panel at the end. Please remember to utilise safe and respectful language in your questions and restrict your questions to the topic and presentations for today. Questions will be asked of a panel, and similar themed questions may be grouped together. If you feel your question is not answered, please email us at Suicide Prevention Australia and we'll endeavour to ensure the question is answered. A recording of today's webinar will be publicly available in the coming days. And finally, we are talking about suicide prevention. And whilst we don't envisage people will be impacted by today's webinar discussion, please reach out to a trusted friend, colleague, or one of the support numbers listed if you feel you need additional support. With that, it is my great pleasure now to hand over to Carl Andreasen for his presentation.
All right, well, thank you, Simon, and also thank you to your colleague Joel and to your team for hosting this webinar and providing us with the opportunity not only to share and talk about our research, but also to engage and continue a conversation and a discussion about the topic of ethical issues in designing suicide prevention studies. Not only because it's very close to our heart, but also because it's important to sustain the quality of the research and to improve suicide prevention in Australia. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we are meeting at this meeting, and I pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. I extend my respect to all the Aboriginal people in Australia, to people with lived experience of suicide, and also to the participants of this webinar. So at this point, I would try to share my screen, which I don't see. Okay, just a second. And try again. So I hope you will be able to see my screen. Yes. Okay. So in this short presentation, I will summarize our research in the field of ethical issues in designing suicide prevention studies. And I will, yes.
Can I just interrupt you? Do you just want to click on your display setting in the menu item? At the top of your menu, display setting, second on the left.
Ah, yes.
Yep, the top one. Thank you.
Is better? Okay, so I will highlight a few important issues from our studies and also make some concluding remarks at the end to set the scene with regards to the topic of this webinar. So we know that suicide research is essential to improve the prevention of suicidal behavior. And as in many countries, Australia also has a national statement on ethical issues, ethical conduct in human research. And the national statement, Australian national statement, includes a few important ethical principles: the principle of respect, research, merit, integrity, justice, and beneficence. And throughout the national statement, there are also a few important themes, such as the risks of research participation for participants, but also for researchers, benefits of the research for participants and for society, and also some considerations about obtaining consent and consent procedures. But despite the fact that the national statement is sometimes very specific, there are also still tensions between suicide researchers and members of research ethics committees regarding how to interpret certain principles or certain topics specified in the national statement. In this context, it's of course important to remember that the national guideline has not been created for suicide studies specifically, and that certain characteristics or specific issues with regards to suicide research may not be covered or may not be fully explained within this national statement. So at our Centre for Mental Health at the University of Melbourne, we have the LifeWays project funded by the Australian government to provide national leadership in suicide prevention research. And within the LifeWays project, we have conducted a project on ethical issues in designing suicide prevention studies. And with this project, we have conducted a few studies. 2 studies have been conducted with researchers, with Australian and international researchers. A 3rd study was conducted with members of research ethics committees, and the 4th study was a consensus study. So in the studies 1 and 2 conducted with Australian and international researchers, we specifically investigated the concerns that researchers received from their ethics committees and how the researchers responded to the concerns that they had received. And what we found in the 2 studies is that most of the concerns that the researchers received were about potential harm to participants and in general concerns regarding the safety of participants. Most of the response that the researchers formulated were in the form of modifications of their research ethics applications and also consultations with their ethics committees. Importantly, modifications to the ethics applications sometimes resulted in major modifications to the design of the study, and sometimes also to important delays in starting the actual research. The third study involved members of human research ethics committees in Australia, and we interviewed members of the committees regarding how they deal with suicide prevention studies applications that they receive in their committees. And we conducted a thematic analysis, but I think most important findings of the study were that members of ethics committees tend to base their assessments on the clarity of the applications and also on how they comply with the national statement, but also importantly, personal beliefs and personal experiences with suicide also played a role in how they made decisions regarding suicide prevention studies applications. And we found that they used these personal views and personal approaches in conjunction with the national statement. So based on these three studies, we noticed that there was an important need for more guidance regarding how to deal with ethical issues in suicide-related studies. And this need was apparent for researchers, for members of human research ethics committees, but based on our findings and on the literature, we also noted this need with regards to study participants and stakeholders, such as, for example, sponsors and funders of research. So based on the three previous studies and the literature, we designed an expert consensus study with people with lived experience of suicide and suicide researchers, and participants were asked to rate a large number of statements on a Likert scale ranging from essential to should not be included in recommendations or guidelines with regards to suicide prevention studies. And we found in the study that there was a substantial agreement between and within the two participant groups, especially with regard to the importance of ethical principles of merit, integrity, justice, beneficence. So the ethical principles that have been integrated in the national statement. And there were some discrepancies between the two panels as well. Lived experience participants emphasized more the importance of the support and care for researchers. And conversely, the researchers emphasized more the importance of risk management protocols and support for participants. But based on of the analysis of the replies from participants, we were able to formulate a few overall recommendations supported by both panels, by both people with lived experience of suicide and the researchers in this field. And these recommendations were that the ethical principles of merit, integrity, justice, beneficence, as explained in the national statement, should be factored into every suicide prevention research project ethics application. Secondly, that support service information must be made available to all research participants, irrespective of the type of the research. The description of risks to participant and risk mitigation strategies for the participant distress must be comprehensive. That only questions relevant to the research must be asked of participants. That sufficient time must be invested to develop high-quality ethics applications by the researchers. That suicide prevention researchers should have active dialogue with their research ethics committees to share relevant information outside the scope of the national statement. That the researchers must have appropriate support and supervision to prevent and mitigate vicarious trauma, and that there should be reflexive empathy between researchers and research participants to include how their experiences may impact the research and the researchers and participants involved. So these points were more or less a summary of the recommendations that were formulated by lived experience participants and the research participants. And we have published all these studies. So if you need more details, feel free to look up the publications or send us an email. We will be happy to share the papers. But for the meeting and the webinar today, I think these summary recommendations were the most important findings. So, and at this stage, I think I can hand over to Jane, who will be introducing the panel further.
Thank you very much, Carl. I'll let you unshare your screen.
Is it now unshared?
No, we can see your desktop.
Oh.
So all those searches you've done, Carl.
Sorry, where should stop sharing? Okay.
Excellent, thank you.
Sorry for that.
So thank you very much, Carl, for that excellent presentation that really does set the scene, all the work that you have led and others have been involved in thinking through what the specific ethical issues might be for suicide prevention research, studies in suicide prevention, and thinking them through from the perspective of researchers, people with lived experience and ethics committees. It's such a great piece of work, and I really also like the fact that it's culminated in these recommendations that hopefully others will find useful. So I get the pleasure of facilitating the panel discussion. So I'm going to briefly introduce all of our panel members, and then I'm going to lead off by asking them some questions. Some of them I'll ask questions individually, some questions will be for the whole panel, and then we'll have some time for some Q&A after that. So our panel members are, and you can see them all on the screen, we've got Michelle Banfield, the fabulous Michelle Banfield, who's a lived experience researcher from ANU, and is a co-director of the Alive National Centre for Mental Health Research Translation. So welcome, Michelle. Phil Batterham, who many of you may know, who's professor and co-head of the Centre for Mental Health Research, again at the Australian National University. So welcome, Phil. Hooray. We can't see the audience members, but I'm assuming you're all clapping as well. Hayley Purdon, the fabulous Hayley Purdon. I have to say, Hayley is one of the most articulate people I've ever met. It's a joy to listen to you, Hayley, when you open your mouth. So Hayley's the suicide lived experience advocate, and she's a PhD candidate and senior technical officer in the Commonwealth Public Service. So brings many perspectives to the discussion today. Chandra Ramamurthy is another person with a wealth of experience. She has a master's in clinical psychology and a master's in applied ethics. So what greater set of qualifications could you have to bring to the discussion? And she's worked in the not-for-profit sector for over 30 years with international and Indian NGOs, but she's also transformed herself as an early career researcher and is doing an MPhil in our centre, the Centre for Mental Health at the University of Melbourne. She also identifies as someone with lived experience of suicide. And then our final panel member is Mandy Casimatis, sorry, Mandy, who's a lecturer in the School of Applied Psychology at Griffith Uni. And Mandy brings particular expertise to the panel because she's sat on ethics committees. So she brings that expertise with her. So fantastic group. I did also just want to acknowledge two people who were originally on the panel but who can't be here today. So Ingrid Ozols, who was going to co-facilitate with me, and Rachel Sabrinskas, who was going to be a member of the panel, both of whom unfortunately are sick, but we wish them well and hopefully they'll be feeling better soon and they'll hear the recording. And I also did want to thank Carl, the fabulous Carl, who's brought all this together, and Karolina Kruszinska and Leonard Rifles, who are co-facilitating the panel. Leonard and Karolina will be fielding the questions at the end. So thank you to everybody, and also thanks to Simon Pont and Joel Albrecht from Suicide Prevention Australia, because without them this wouldn't have happened either. So let me kick off. What we asked the panel members to do initially was, when we were in the process of asking them to send in brief bios. We also asked them to make a statement about something that was occurring to them about issues, ethical issues in suicide prevention research, and they had all sorts of interesting things to say. So I've used some of those statements as kind of a kick-off point for some of the first questions. And Michelle, hopefully it's all right, I'm going to start with you. In your statement, you said that it was important to take a nuanced approach to ethics in suicide prevention research, incorporating lived experience perspectives on processes and research design. Could I just ask you, as a lived experience researcher, what your thoughts are on how we might best do this? How do we take that nuanced approach?
Thanks, Jane. And I want to apologise in advance. I've got all these things happening. My computer suddenly decided that it must restart, and I don't know, not now. And there's this beeping that keeps popping up. So please excuse me if I'm very distractible. There's all these things happening. So, yeah, I had a bit of a think about that statement, and because I wear lots of different hats when it comes to my research. And so first and foremost, I am a lived experience researcher, and that drives everything that I do. And I'm always looking for how lived experience can drive research and what we're doing. And as a part of that, over the years, it was my observation that ethics committees took a very, in some cases, sledgehammer approach to implementation of the national statement. And obviously, all of those principles are a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned. As researchers, we need to adhere to the national statement because it's been created in a particular way, and it's now being revised to think about some of its sledgehammer approaches. But what we have the responsibility as researchers to do is to inform the ethics committee of how we are actually adhering to those principles, so that they don't come back and just have these broad brush approaches saying, well, I don't think that's safe. And that's where lived experience comes into it. And so as researchers, what we need to actually do is look at what we are proposing in terms of methods, consult with people with lived experience of suicide, use our own experience. And in my case, I took the next step and joined the ethics committee. And so in that case, then that was part of that nuanced approach, because they said to me when I pulled them up on one of their sledgehammer responses that was really stigmatising, we need inside information and we need the influence. And so that's what I meant when I sort of said nuanced approach. As researchers, we really have a responsibility to ensure that what we put forward demonstrates that we've thought about it, because the number of ethics applications that I've seen that effectively said, trust me. And I'm like, why? Why should I trust you? You're not demonstrating why I should trust you. And part of that is pulling people with lived experience into demonstrating that I've thought about what approach I'm taking. I've thought about who it is that needs to be a part of it. I've talked with those people, and it's so much more powerful when you're then the person on the ethics committee, and particularly as a lived experience researcher on the ethics committee, to see, okay, it looks risky that we might be actually wanting to engage with people who have, for example, chronic suicidal ideation like I do, but they've talked to people like me and they have said, we hate being patted on the head and told we can't engage in research.
Excellent. Thank you, Michelle. That's a great answer. And Hayley, I've got a question for you, which is kind of similar, really. In fact, quite similar, but I'm sure you'll have additional things to say. So you talked about what Michelle's talking about in your statement. You said there's this commonly held misconception that people who are suicidal, if they're asked to be involved in suicide prevention research, it will be a risk. So do you want to talk a little bit more about that, about the misconception, but also maybe why you think it is held?
Yeah, so I suppose building on Michelle's comment about not wanting to be patted on the head as a person who experiences thoughts of suicide, if you think about what that feels like, people who are suicidal often feel disconnected from people around them, alone, like they have no purpose, that their existence is just a burden on other people. But then you think about the experience of conducting research, and that's all about connecting with people, understanding different perspectives, learning from each other, turning a situation or an experience into something positive, some knowledge that benefits, you know, the wider community. So really, I see the two kind of needing each other, you know, by including voices of lived experience, especially the risk group of people who experience thoughts of suicide. You're promoting healing and allowing them to express things where they don't have necessarily an environment where they can express those things safely. If you think about the hard to reach populations of people who aren't connected with any health services or other forms of support, by allowing them into research practice, you're connecting them in with a form of support. If we put ethical controls around the research, you've got things like offering avenues to get help, you know, follow-up conversations with participants. Those are forms of support for people. So yeah, really, it's kind of a benefit. And you have to remember that this is people's lives that we're researching. They live this daily. We're not going in there and asking them to put themselves in a risky situation. They're in this risky situation. And so the best thing that we really can do is meet them where they are. And I've got an example of this. A recent project that I took part in, Luke Bayliss is doing a PhD working to understand the experience of being suicidal and making a suicide attempt. And that is a high risk group, right? But his approach in conducting his research was to listen non-judgmentally, to ask open questions that allowed me and other participants to really explain what we had felt, what we'd been through in our own words. He listened deeply. I personally felt understood. It was a relief to be able to share these things in a space where I'm not often asked or given permission to share these things. He followed up with a phone call and text check-ins. And really, the other point I want to make is it's all about context. Like, we know that speaking openly about particular things about suicide can be harmful, but this is a one-on-one context or a focus group context. They're small environments, they're not in public. And the care that we need around people who have a lived experience of suicide are very different to out in the public, where we don't know who they are, we don't have any contact with them. So it's not, ethics committees shouldn't just be kind of asking, you know, who is the person that you're interviewing, who's the population of interest, but about you know, how are you doing it? What topics are you going to explore, and what are the things that you're going to put in place to support that person to safely participate? So yeah, really, it's not about saying, hey, these people are risky, we need to put them to one side, you can't ask that, but about, you know, how are you going to ask that and doing it safely.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Hayley. So it's more about that nuanced approach that Michelle's talking about. Mandy, maybe I could ask you, I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say on the basis of what Michelle and Hayley have said, having sat on ethics committees. So do you get the feeling that ethics committees are more concerned than they should be about risk, or maybe not concerned enough? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Sometimes there can be a misconception amongst the committee members that by asking about people and participants in suicide research about their suicide risk, that it might actually prompt them to get ideas about suicide or increase their risk, which is always why it's good to have someone from a school of psychology, for example, on the committee, and as well as people who have had lived experience or so on the committee. So by having those sorts of people there, they can actually then burst the bubble that those myths have. So yeah, definitely they can be quite cautious in terms of posing risk to participants in research, and that can be one misconception that's quite common.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So yeah, it does make sense, and so it's obviously something that is of concern and makes the kinds of guidelines that Carl and others have worked on really important, I think, because it does get people kind of on the same page. So Phil, I might come to you as the longest standing suicide prevention researcher on the panel. So I know you've thought about this quite deeply over time. In your statement, you said that the quality and safety of suicide prevention research may be strengthened by considering existing evidence for potential risks and benefits of conducting research in this area. So, so you're going to the evidence from studies about what the risk might look like. And also, I think your statement said something about considering the implications of not conducting the research, or the implications of excluding people who might be at risk. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so thanks, Jane. Without wanting to sound like a broken record and echoing a lot of the things that have been said already, I think ethics committees aren't typically out looking for a fight, but they may not necessarily have the expertise or the specialist knowledge around suicide prevention and how that can be conducted ethically and safely. We saw from Carl's presentation that the personal beliefs of HREC members, ethics committees members, can come into decision making. But what we can do, as Michelle said, is bring in voices of lived experience to further our case that the research can be done safely, ethically. But also we can bring in the empirical evidence. So our research has found that asking a very extensive battery of questions about suicidality in a community-based sample doesn't typically lead to increased levels of distress. We see that for people who don't already have thoughts about suicide, it's very unlikely to induce thinking about suicide if people are asked the question. And among those who are experiencing thoughts of suicide, the most common response we see to being asked questions about their suicidal experience is a sense of relief, as Hayley mentioned in response to her question. So I think it's important that we educate and work with ethics committees to ensure that they do can have that access to that sort of specialist knowledge around the safety of conducting suicide prevention research. The other comment I made was about the effect of excluding people, and Hayley touched on this too. Often in clinical trials, for example, for other mental health problems such as depression, we see that people with suicidal experience are excluded from these types of trials. So we don't know from the outcomes of whether the intervention or the program is effective for people who are experiencing suicidal thoughts, for example. So that sort of reactive approach to excluding people from research means that the voices that might be most important are not necessarily being heard. So we need to think about both the risks of including participants in our research, as well as the potential benefits, as well as the risks of not including certain groups within our research that we conduct.
Excellent, thank you, Phil. That's an additional perspective on I guess what has been a similar question that I've asked all of you. So Chandra, that brings me to you. So your statement was actually a little bit different. You said, or you described ethical issues in suicide prevention research as a formidable task, particularly in low and middle income countries like India. So I wondered if you'd like to tell us a little bit more about your perspective on that.
Thank you, Jane. I come from India, and as most of you all know, we are up there along with Australia in terms of increasing number of deaths by suicide, especially in the younger age group. And it is a challenging task for me because I wear the hat of a researcher currently, as well as a mom bereaved by suicide. My challenges are unique because when I learned from here, I find it more difficult to apply it in India because India is not homogeneous. We have different struggles there in terms of looking at discrimination, exclusion, availability of support, availability of care, especially mental health care. And then there is a role of media. There is a role of how suicides are being recorded. There are challenges in every step. So as a researcher, I look at what is happening in Australia, especially where I am studying in now, because there is a lot more input going in. What should be the ethical guidelines for research? How do you decide and design better suicide prevention studies? I think there is enormous potential to develop uniform guidelines that will inform global studies. I think it's a challenge in some way, but it has enormous inputs to give for countries like India, where we are still in our infancy in terms of looking at how research around suicide can be formulated, what kind of ethical guidelines should be developed, what kind of participants should be engaged, and especially voices of people who have been bereaved, people who have been challenged by the issue, people with lived experiences, along with researchers and along with people who are working in public health and the medical setup.
Thank you, Chandra. That's an excellent answer. So I might ask this next question of everybody, but I'm going to ask it of a couple of people at a time. So I guess in thinking about this this webinar and this panel, I guess if we'd got a similar group of people together and run a webinar kind of just out of the blue, we might have heard similar things. But the difference between this webinar and others is that Carl and others had done all that work beforehand, which culminated in recommendations for researchers and ethics committees about how to deal with ethical issues in suicide prevention research. So I was going to ask the panel members to reflect on the recommendations that came out of the consensus study. And I'm not asking you to reflect particularly on specific recommendations, but just as a set of recommendations, whether they would be useful in your context. So I might start with Michelle and Phil as fairly experienced suicide prevention researchers. How useful are the recommendations for you? Do you think they'll be helpful for you?
Look, I think there's a lot of sense in the guidelines, and that's one of the things that I think, you know, in terms of guiding what we're trying to achieve here. You know, I sort of said earlier that we have a responsibility as researchers to make sure that we give the ethics committees what they actually need to understand. And one of the things that struck me as I kind of really pondered on the statements that sat behind, you know, the proposed guidelines is, you know, I mean, as an experienced researcher, particularly in the lived experience field and who's been on an ethics committee, there was nothing new to that in me. But I also know as an ethics committee member that there's a lot in there that people probably don't really understand as important. And so I think that the value that I see in that is reiterating with people that we have a responsibility as researchers and as people with lived experience to inform our ethics committees about what it is that we actually see as good quality ethical research in the suicide prevention space. And, you know, I was reflecting on something that I saw recently that somebody had tweeted about, oh, I'm always telling the ethics committees the same thing in my response. And I thought, well, that kind of makes me think you're the stupid one here, because if you put the same thing in and you always get the same response, how about putting something different in? And that's where I see the value of this, that if we actually, ethics committees do learn. Funnily enough, they're made up mostly of researchers and some really smart people. And if they have the wrong end of the stick on something, they love it if somebody can actually teach them something new. And that's the value that I see here, that this work has been done with the people, all of the different people who are in this process. And if we now say, instead of taking the, I'm a good suicide researcher, trust me, approach to our applications, in which you will always get the response of, tell me more. How about tell me more in the first place?
That's excellent, Michelle. Thank you. I always love your pithy responses. Phil, what about you? What do you think about the recommendations? How useful or otherwise are they for you or someone in your at your career stage, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, I think the recommendations provide a really useful framework for thinking about ethical considerations within suicide prevention research. That said, I think it's really hard to provide a sort of one-size-fits-all approach. It's not a checklist approach to thinking about the ethics of a specific project. You need to think about the research design and the sorts of questions or data that you're collecting. So I think it's important to, as a starting point, to have a broad set of principles that suicide prevention researchers should be considering when they're designing their research and developing their ethical protocols. But that's not the end of the story. So thinking about the specifics of their study and how it might be reflected in those principles. I note that a lot of the sort of top-rated principles are very vague sort of statements about do ethical research, essentially, which is probably less helpful for an established researcher. Some of them are probably more useful as a sort of a checklist for what to think about for emerging researchers. But that said, I think having a whole list of 80 different statements that were considered and thinking about all the different issues that might come up is a really valuable guide for all researchers in suicide prevention.
Excellent, thanks, Phil. And I like the way you give me a great segue there, where you say it might be different for early career researchers. Let's ask Chandra and Hayley what they think about the recommendations. Are they helpful for you at your career stage?
You go first, Chandra.
Okay. I think it has enormous potential, especially for where I come from. So I agree with Phil when he says that there is no one size fits all. There is going to be a variation in terms of how people look at ethical issues in different countries. But I think it provides a kind of a framework that we can take back to countries like even India, and we can build on it. We can build the nuances that are particular to our culture, to our country, and put that in a larger framework. It gives me a very positive feeling. It actually makes me feel that there is hope for better informed research, especially in suicide preventions. And if we can look at places like Australia to take it back from, I think there is no better way.
That's great. Thank you, Chandra. And how about you, Hayley?
As an early career researcher, what I've found is that we're really good, or research is really good at putting out knowledge about a topic, but not so good about putting out how to find that knowledge. And, you know, in the formation of my own research, I've had a lot of trouble finding guidance about how to structure studies. So yes, these principles and recommendations are really useful for people who might need guidance about how to structure stuff. Like, for example, when I was doing my master's research, I was asking people to tell their lived experience story, and going to the ethics committee, I had to really find information kind of out of nowhere about why my research was safe. And so having something like this would have been really good to say, hey, look, I'm doing it according to these guidelines, ethics board, so you can see that what I'm doing is shown to be safe. But there's also research out there that is not quite so ethical. Like recently I took part in a study on something related to suicide, and without warning a page popped up that just listed all of these suicide methods, and it was asking questions of people with lived experience, and it was quite confronting. So if there were some guidelines to say, hey, you might need some controls around this, like there was no help-seeking lines or anything displayed on the page, but if there was a document that said, hey, do this, and you can ask all these difficult questions, I think it would be really valuable. So yes, definitely, Jane, these recommendations are really valued.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm getting a similar message that they're very valuable, but they can kind of only go so far, because they, by design, they can't answer every single question. Let me just complete the circle though and ask Mandy, do you think that the recommendations would be useful for ethics committees? How do you think they'd respond to them?
Yeah, I do think the recommendations would be useful for ethics committees to take into account. Again, I think that it's difficult to apply blanket rules to all research in any area for ethics committees. So each study does need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis according to its, research design and strengths and potential risks. So I guess drawing on sort of what Hayley said, she's had that experience, for example, where she has been part of a research study where some of the questions were quite confronting for participants about methods of suicide. So yeah, we need to be looking at applying, I guess, those recommendations with keeping in mind the necessary precautions that should be taken as well in all research, really, not just applying to suicide. So
excellent, thank you, Mandy. So my next question flows from that, and I'm just going to throw it open. So if you have an answer, feel free to go for it, and if you don't have anything to say, that's fine too. And it kind of relates to that thing about the view that the recommendations are very useful in general terms, but they're not going to cover off on everything. It kind of brings me to the question about implementing them. How do people have clues about the best way to implement a set of recommendations like this? How would you disseminate them? How would you get them out there? How would you make sure that what we're seeing as good things about them are picked up?
I'm happy to jump in first.
Yeah.
The dissemination piece, that's not my bucket of expertise, being relatively new to academia. But what I see is a value in kind of implementing these is to move from a researcher versus researched dichotomy and more of like a partnerships model to help research institutions develop guidance and training that allows them to better work with people with lived experience, and then they can take these recommendations in partnership and really discuss why these things are important, and that increases understanding across both parties.
Excellent. That's a great response. It does make me reflect on one of the things that I thought was really interesting in the work that Carl presented, which was that the people with lived experience gave a lot of emphasis to support for researchers, and the people with the researchers gave lots of emphasis to what they called care for participants. So the parties are quite willing to look out for each other, which is only kind of one step removed from working together. And there's obviously good consensus here. So I guess that's a positive thing for implementing the recommendations and getting them into practice. Did other people have comments about the implementation side of things?
It's nice to see that. Sorry, go ahead, Phil. I was just going to say it's nice to hear about the mutual caring for each other. I mean, I think events like this are obviously a great platform for disseminating the outcomes of the research that's been done. But I guess moving forward, it's about disseminating through research groups, and there needs to be, I think, partnerships between sort of senior researchers in suicide prevention, but also partnering with people with lived experience to understand how best we apply these sorts of guiding principles to our research.
Yeah, I think that's right, Phil. That's a good way of putting it. And Michelle.
Yeah, and I mean, just sort of, I completely agree with what Phil just said. And also, when it comes to something like a set of guidelines, I mean, I think there's probably more work to do in some specifics that people have been talking about in terms of, warnings. Hayley, I've been in research too where something unexpected come up, and if I'd been warned that it was there, it probably wouldn't have been an issue. But when it comes and hits you in the face and you just go, well, I wasn't expecting that. Those kinds of things are some of the stuff that I think senior researchers need to be talking with early career researchers around. But I also think in terms of where should these guidelines be, I'm in favour of a kitchen sink approach. And so, providing them to all of the different ethics committees that are operating. And I think, one of the things that we've noticed is that much as I loathe their processes, going through some of the health associated ethics committees, you have less problems with putting this type of research through those committees because they understand more of that than the university-based committees who have to deal with things from so many different disciplines that they can't be across everything. And so I think providing some guidance to all of the committees just as a sort of starting point. And as Phil said, a lot of the stuff about following the statement and that sort of thing is going to be logical to the committees, but some of the more specific stuff around care for researchers and participants, which is actually written into the statement and most people don't notice that it is, but care for researchers is actually there. But also, you know, can it be put in with the NHMRC so that it comes up? You know, Hayley made an interesting point earlier about searching for this information and not being able to find it. The more places we put it, the more likely people are to find it in the way they go about it. So there is a paper, and I'm not sure whether it's behind a paywall or not, but if it is, then there needs to be a method for people to get at it that's not. But through the ethics committees, through the research institutes that are dealing in suicide prevention research, through our consumer and carer peaks, you know, everywhere we can think of, and having somewhere really accessible so that when you go, you know what, I want some principles to back up my application, which is nuanced and has talked with people with lived experience. But if you've got a committee that wants where's the guideline that says this is the right thing, that it's really easy for people to actually put their hands on such a thing.
Yeah. I do like that expression, the kitchen sink approach. Although you'd never find it if you looked in my kitchen sink. So I'm going to move on to the next question, but I'm going to give Mandy and Chandra the first opportunity to answer it because they didn't get the opportunity to answer the other question. So before we got together for the webinar, we had a meeting just to kind of scope out what the event would look like. And we had this very wide-ranging discussion at it, which in fact, had we recorded that, we could have presented that as the webinar. It was very interesting. And one of the things that came out of that for me was people talked about the fact that people bring very different types of experience to the table when they're considering ethical issues in suicide prevention research. So I don't just mean, as Hayley just said, the researchers and the researched, but the people with lived experience aren't a homogenous group. So people with lived experience come with all sorts of different experiences and perspectives, as do researchers. And of course, there are plenty of researchers who have lived experience themselves. So I'm just wondering what you, my panel members, think that might mean for recommendations, thinking about those different audiences, what that might mean for how these sorts of recommendations might be implemented. So as I said, I'll give Chandra and Mandy the first go, although don't feel obliged if you don't want to answer the question, but I just wanted to give you the chance.
I'm happy to go first if you like, Chandra. So yeah, so with that, I guess it's about looking at, you know, do ethics committees in general actually apply a standardised approach when they evaluate these applications for suicide research? I mean, we'd like to think that following the current NHMRC guidelines that we generally do, and that's what the aim really is. So I guess when it comes to then implementing recommendations for suicide research, then we'd hope to have a similar sort of outcome in terms of hopefully there'd generally be some consensus around decision making for particular studies and their approval, and what conditions are required. So I guess it's about in that way doing enough research as well as being informed enough from a variety of people with lived experience to then come to some conclusions about exactly what those recommendations should include for each of the committees before dissemination and implementation.
Excellent, thank you, Mandy. And Chandra, did you have anything to add? You're on mute.
I completely agree, because you cannot formulate ethical guidelines by leaving someone out, and people who have lived experience bring in that richness to the context. I'm sure ethical issues like confidentiality, protection, safety are built into ethical guidelines. I think that is the norm. We just need to use those and make that more coherent, make that more dynamic, because it's just a holistic way of looking at suicide prevention. You cannot leave one or the other out. And I love the kitchen sink analogy, because when you say where should this be, it should be everywhere. It should inform every student who is doing research as to what should be the ethical guidelines to designing suicide prevention studies. It should be in every college, it should be in every university, it should be in every teaching institute, medical, non-medical. So the potential is immense. Of course, I'm looking at the Indian context. So where there is zero, we are happy to have any.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Chandra. So I'm going to ask my final question, then I'm going to open up for questions from the floor, and I can see that questions have been coming through in the chat. So my final question, and again, I'm going to throw it open, but don't feel like everyone has to answer it. You know, having worked in suicide prevention myself for a long time, I would say that there's still a lot we don't know about what works and what doesn't work in suicide prevention. There's probably more that we don't know than we do know. And I wonder how much difference you think that overcoming some of these ethical issues would make to furthering knowledge. So maybe I might actually ask Phil first, because I know that Phil has thought about this a bit.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. I guess there's a whole lot of barriers to doing high quality suicide prevention research, not least of which is funding, but also capacity in the space of building capacity in some of the great early career, mid-career researchers that are coming through in suicide prevention, and making sure there is that sort of next generation of researchers coming through. There have been a number of initiatives that have been funded over the past few years to make suicide prevention research happen and at a greater scale. So I think that having sort of guidelines and templates can help by sort of streamlining the process and ensure that the quality of research that's coming through the pipeline is as high as it can be. So it's one of the sort of many barriers, but sort of making sort of a collective and a community approach around how best we do this type of research is really important for making the research process more efficient and I think more effective in the long run.
Excellent, thanks, Phil. And others, are there other comments on that final question?
Yeah, I'm going to give you another one of those.
And then I have something else to say after
Sure.
Michelle, because I always have something to add.
Yeah, I'm going to give you one of those pithy, controversial remarks here.
Excellent, like that.
Look, one of the big barriers that I see to things like this is actually the attitude that I see so much about from researchers of viewing the ethics process as a speed bump in their research. And so, you know, one of the things that I try to instill in all of the people that I mentor is that the ethics process is not only a critical element of what we are doing, it is also actually an opportunity to engage really deeply with your methods, to engage really deeply with people's lived experience, and to think about what it is that we're trying to achieve. And so, you know, thinking again about my mate that, you know, said that it was stupid ethics committees that kept giving him the same response instead of thinking about who was actually the foolish one here. We need to think about how we start to engage with our up and coming researchers around the centrality of ethical issues to what we do. And this is so important in the suicide prevention space. If we're going to move out of these very paternalistic responses to from ethics committees, the onus is actually on us as the researchers to demonstrate how much work we have done to think through the issues genuinely, because otherwise they just have to resort to the paternalistic responses because they are charged with ensuring the safety of both the researchers and the participants. And if we don't give them what they need by demonstrating that we've thought about these issues, then of course they're going to turn around and say, you can't do that. And then we end up locked in these, you know, headbutting kinds of back and forth. So I think, controversial though it might be for somebody, I want to put the call out to all of our researchers, stop thinking about ethics as a speed bump and think about it as the core of what we're doing.
I think that's a really good reminder, Michelle. Pithy as ever. Thank you. And Hayley.
I suppose building on what Michelle said about the paternalistic approach, I see the value in these recommendations and starting conversations with lived experience about what are the ethical controls needed. I see it moving us from a place of risk mitigation and to a space of safety promotion first. I think we over risk manage suicide prevention and lived experience, and only in kind of changing that will we start to see more open conversations with lived experience and build on that knowledge base that, like you said, Jane, we don't know so much, and that's because we're not asking people because we're afraid. So yeah, these recommendations I think are going to help us move towards that more accepted and open conversations in this space.
Excellent, thank you. And I can see you getting nods from your fellow panel members. All right, well, so I've got a little timetable here that Carl provided us with, and we're now at the point on the timetable where we're going to take some Q&A from the audience. And I'm going to hand over to Lennart and Carolina, who've been monitoring the questions, and will be able to guide the discussion. And I can help.
Thanks, Jane. I'm happy to make a start, Carolina, if you like. We've had some good feedback from participants here. A lot of the comments raised by the panel sort of were affirmed and resonated. But we had a couple of questions also that we might be able to put back to the panel. One of them related to a particular type of research and another one to a particular type of setting. So I'm not sure if you had the chance to read those, but I can read them out to you and then maybe you can direct them to the right panel member. And we've just had an interesting comment coming in also in relation to those types of resources that document the risks that are evident or not evident in the types of sort of things that we do in research and where we can find access to those. But I might direct you, maybe first a question raised by Deborah earlier on, a slightly technical term within it. I hope I pronounce it right. But she asked whether the panel had any guidance perhaps in relation to ethnographic research and the ethical parameters around that. And I believe Philip might have alluded earlier on sort of to the fact that different approaches might require different considerations. So I wonder if anyone on the panel might have some considerations around this.
I wonder perhaps, Michelle, whether you might. I'm just thinking ethnographic research may be closest to some of your work.
Yeah, I did see that. And ethnography is a very specific kind of method, and it's not one that I've really genuinely used. So I was a little bit leery about really saying much in that space. But I think one of the things, I mean, without actually saying this is what you should do if you're thinking about ethnography, and the question is specifically about autoethnography, is whatever method you choose, it's really good to talk with somebody who is the intended participant. And, you know, I talk to myself all the time, so, you know, that's okay. We can talk to ourselves if it's an autoethnography. But I think thinking about things like what Hayley raised earlier about if we talk with people about lived experience about how we actually want to approach things and what might be some of the topics that we're actually going to cover in things and how they might appear to people, then I think that's actually one of our most powerful ways of overcoming these kinds of things, because I think the mistake that we often make in this kind of thing when trying to develop guidelines is we say, you should have a blah for...
Oh, Michelle, you've frozen.
Possibly things like a distress protocol.
Sorry, Michelle, we're losing bits of you.
Sorry, that's because I'm hotspotting and it was always going to happen. It lasted this long. Yeah, I was just saying, you know, I think I think that other than things like a distress protocol and making sure that we always have tailored lists of support services, I really think that for every method, talk to the people who are going to be involved about what you think you actually should do and how you should manage things. And so, you know, an example that we have is that when we are talking with vulnerable populations, and I don't like that term, but, you know, about particularly in interview studies or probably similar to ethnography, we now have a process by which we ask somebody before the interview to think, should they have unexpected reactions, who can they call, who can they talk to? And we don't tell them who it should be. It's just, you know what, if this actually makes you feel uncomfortable, tell me now, or write down for yourself who it is that you can actually get in contact with. And we do that in a very respectful way so that people don't feel like we're telling them they're going to get distressed by what we're asking them. But that was a process that we developed in collaboration with people with lived experience. So that's where I think lived experience can really come into us extending the populations that we want to talk with and giving the opportunity for people who really want to contribute to research but are traditionally called too vulnerable to then be able to create those methods.
Excellent. Leonard, sorry, I'll have to let you and Carolina do the questions because I couldn't keep tabs on the chat while I was chairing, so I'll leave you to.
There is a question from Andrew, who is a PhD student, and he's got a question if there is a repository of valuable ways, such as proforma text, to address some of the suicide research ethic risks and how they can be mitigated.
So I was going to actually ask a question along similar lines, and maybe I'll ask my question as well, and perhaps we can consider both questions at once. So one of the things we talked about doing when we started doing this ethical research on ethical issues in suicide prevention research was we talked about putting together a repository of ethics applications that had been approved. So as far as I know, in answer to the question that was asked, there's nothing that does exist like that. But I wonder what the panel thinks about that, whether that would be a helpful thing. I guess because it would create some precedents for maybe similar projects to one that you might be trying to do yourself that have been approved in the past by some ethics committee somewhere.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about that. I think because there is so much nuance in across different research studies, and you know, even the types of questions that are being asked, the types of populations that you're going out to, as we've discussed throughout this panel, there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and even within specific research designs, there's not a one-size-fits-all. It's about thinking through all the possible risks, all the possible outcomes that you need to consider for that specific research study. That said, I think, yeah, it's more about sort of partnering with people who have the expertise in that space who have done it before, as well as partnering with lived experience. But there may also be sort of a space to extend this research that's already been done and think about what sort of recommendations might be given for specific research designs, for example, for focus groups in qualitative research versus for clinical trials, and whether there are sort of specific guidelines or things to consider at least for those types of research before launching into it.
I want to add to what you've just said, Philip, and bringing us back to what Michelle said earlier about viewing ethics as a speed bump and wanting researchers to fully engage in the safety of their research and the ethical conduct of their research. So, you know, like what you said, Phil, around having a database of, you know, if they ask this, you can say this, it kind of stops that process from happening. And, you know, the researchers should really be engaging with what's out there that shows that doing this is safe because of these reasons. And yeah, I don't think that researchers should really shortcut that process.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on what Hayley just said in terms of shortcuts, because the ANU committee has actually avoided having examples of anything available, because what they found is that people cut and paste and they don't read what it is. And when I say cut and paste, our current chair has a really wry sense of humour and has created the template for our information sheet using Harry Potter as an example of the research. And you would be shocked at the number of information sheets we get that still have references to Harry Potter things within them, because people don't look, they take the shortest. And this is the thing, you know, I like the idea of teaching people and sharing with people what does it look like when you actually genuinely do this. But the problem with repositories is that people will go, yeah, I think that's what I want. I'll just cut and paste from that in here and we're done.
Just another comment that Michelle made me think of is that ethics committees are not all the same. So what one ethics committee may raise as an issue, another ethics committee may not. So doing things in a way that one ethics committee expects may not translate to another ethics committee necessarily.
I see you're nodding too, Mandy. You agree with that?
Yeah, there can be definitely some variability depending on who's on the ethics committee and their background experience as well. So yeah, definitely those variations can happen, although usually everyone tries to apply the guidelines as much as possible. So yeah.
Excellent, thank you. So Leonard, did you have another question from the chat?
Yes, we do have a couple more, and maybe if I may just quickly expand on, rather than having ethics applications available, just having general evidence papers that summarize the evidence on the risks and benefits of research does not necessarily provide a shortcut to writing an ethics application, but it can actually inform what those benefits and risks are. I think that might be another way to think about it, and having access to those papers, which we have to sort of scramble and find ourselves, could be an easy way we could provide quite potentially as well. But there was one question earlier on in relation to a particular research setting, which I mentioned. And I understand it to be a research-related question, but it actually relates to the safe havens in New South Wales. I'm not sure if you've seen this earlier on. And the question there is that in New South Wales, and this is from Laura Christie at the Central Coast, LHD, we're developing safe haven spaces that are non-clinical spaces led by suicide prevention peer workers, where members of the community who are in psychosocial distress or experiencing suicidal ideation can go as an alternative to the emergency department. Now, she says the ministry's position is that it's anonymous, and identified visits to safe havens is not supported. And the ethical question is then clinical versus non-clinical, and the right for people to attend non-clinical spaces led by New South Wales Health and remain anonymous. Noting that some districts offer anonymous visits as a result of co-design processes. So I think this is probably partly a broader reflection on these types of support spaces, but maybe from a research angle, it could be a question also to see what that means for conducting research in these spaces and the implications for that. So maybe we can put that as a question to the panel. And I see Michelle is smirking. Others are probably too and keen to jump onto it. Anyone willing to have a go?
The reason I was chuckling is because I'm leading a 3-state project into safe havens, including some of the New South Wales ones. So, but, you know, the question is much more about clinical ethics than research ethics, and that's not my specialty. You know, I think that's an interesting issue that may very well come up in the research that we're doing on safe havens, because we are trying to understand what the main principles are for people who attend the safe havens. What are the key aspects of it that are really setting them aside as non-clinical spaces? What are the effects of the co-design processes? Because they all have community-based models of care that are different, and some have clinical connections and some don't. And so I think that issues like, you know, were raised here about, can you attend a New South Wales site or run site that requires you to disclose information you don't want to disclose? Is probably going to be things that come up, because we actually do have some models that are run directly through the local health districts, and we have others that are on a commissioning model that are run by NGOs. And so some of those kinds of issues, I think, is actually going to be what we actually explore in the research study.
Supposed to add to that from a lived experience perspective, I would be going to the ministry and saying, why do you need that information from people? And are you willing to accept that people may not attend because you require that information? So not an ethical kind of consideration, more like a program design consideration. Because, you know, if you want this, what are the consequences and are they willing to accept that?
There is another question in the chat from Darren. Could the panel comment on discussing suicide prevention research, ethical aspects in suicide prevention research in vulnerable populations, such as people with intellectual disability?
Any of our esteemed panel members like to take that one?
Having worked with Darren a little bit in this space, I think it's all the same sort of issues apply, but it's sort of amplified or magnified because you got to think about the ethical issues of working with sort of multiple intersecting populations, I guess. But I think it's also important that we do this type of work with priority populations, people who are at greater risk of suicide, because not doing it, again, we're not sort of meeting the needs of those specific groups. So it's, again, unethical to sort of bury our heads in the sand and shy away from the challenges. But yeah, there are sort of additional challenges of working in that space.
I hope I'm not kind of taking over the panel here.
No, Hayley.
But I have a previous career of being a disability support worker, mainly with people with intellectual disability. And it absolutely astounded me how excluded people with intellectual disability are from choices and control over their own care. And I see it in the lived experience of suicide space and the mental health space. And so really the fields aren't that different. Maybe the field of intellectual disability needs more support to kind of include those voices, but the ethical considerations are only going to be enhanced when we start to have those conversations with people with intellectual disability, and to give the support around that, the systems in place to enable those conversations to be really meaningful. We need to stop expecting them to come and be able to have our intellectual conversations with us, with our broad, the high level academic language and all of that, because they just don't get it. So we need to start having plain language conversations. We need to meet them where they're at in order to understand what their ethical considerations are.
It's a very good point, Hayley, and exactly the reason why you're not dominating the panel. Exactly the reason why you're on the panel. How are we going for questions? I can see there's lots happening in the chat. Not all of it's questions. There's lots of sharing of information, which is fantastic. Have you got other questions there, Leonard or Carolina?
I think we're looking pretty good, but please, anyone, do correct me and prove me wrong. If we missed something substantial that we should address, this is the time to do it. Maybe repost or let us know. But I think we've covered most areas.
Excellent. All right. What I might do then is, well, if people do think of questions afterwards, feel free to email any of us. I'm sure everyone will be happy to respond. What I might do, though, is let each panel member say one final thing, but I'm going to make you say it in one sentence, and it can't have too many clauses in it. And I'm going to go round. I might start with Chandra. I'll start with you. Anything you'd like to say by way of summing up, or something that's occurred to you that you haven't had the opportunity to say about ethical issues in suicide prevention research?
I agree with most of the panel members, because the challenges are the same, maybe multiplied or magnified for a country like India, where we have different challenges altogether. But I think it's not so difficult to develop or design a suicide prevention study if you take into consideration everyone that needs to be included. It's a no-brainer. It's basically you just make sure everyone is included, the right filters are in, the right questions are asked, the safety nets are in. So there is enormous, I just see the potential of all this conversation, because whatever we do in one part of the world just amplifies to the other. In this day and age, we just share so many ideas. I'm sitting right here to be taking some of these back with me. So I think it's a very, very useful conversation.
Excellent, thank you. And I think that was one sentence. It did have a few clauses in it, but well done. Mandy, I'll go to you next. What would be your final word?
Sure. That was one word, but not a sentence. So I'll move
Oh,
into
sorry,
my sentence.
final sentence. Sorry.
That's all right. I'm moving to my sentence now. So I guess there's really, and coming out of this conversation, it's quite clear there's really a common goal between people with lived experience, suicide researchers and ethics committees, and that is to really mitigate risk, but also for each of those parties to have an understanding of some great ways to go about that, some safe practices, and to all be on the same page essentially when it comes to writing up ethics applications and having them approved. So
excellent, thank you. And I think that would be my takeaway too, that there's much more commonality than difference in where everyone's trying to get to. Phil, how about you? What's your final sentence?
I'll keep it short. Considering ethics for suicide prevention research is challenging, it should take time and it should be collaborative. You can't do it alone.
Excellent. Nice sentence. Well done. Michelle, now that you've reappeared, I'm going to ask you for your final sentence.
My computer just suddenly went critical battery. Uh-oh. So, I would say give your application to ethics the time and love that it really deserves by engaging with people who are the people you would like to participate, to engage with other suicide prevention researchers, so that the final product is something you're proud of.
Excellent. Excellent advice. Thank you, Michelle. And Hayley, I'm going to give you the last word.
I don't know if that's a good thing. I now have the mic. No, I'm really excited for the future, because we're starting to have these conversations about opening up the discussion to people at the pointy end of the risk spectrum, and to really start to learn from them. So I think the only place we can go is up from here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hayley. I'm going to get everyone to, maybe people can virtually clap the panel. Thank you all so much. That was fantastic. It was absolutely, I knew it was going to be great, but I think it's been absolutely brilliant. My one final thing I'm going to do is ask Carl to come back on, because it was Carl's whole brainchild. So I just want Carl to re-emerge if he can. I can see his little initials there. Maybe he's gone off to make a cup of tea. Oh, here he is. Carl, welcome back. I just wanted to let you have the absolute final word. We're so appreciative of all the work you've done, and also setting up this great webinar. So maybe you might just like to say, did it meet your expectations? Was it what you were hoping for, or something else?
Well, Jane, I was hoping to slip away at the end of the
No way.
But well, certainly it exceeds any expectation, I guess, that I had or that we had when we started talking about this panel discussion and this webinar. I think the conversation, the ideas, is really lots of food for thought. I don't think we have lots of answers, but I think we have lots of questions and topics that we can consider to further look at the suicide prevention research and how to design the studies. So rather than being an end point, I think this is a starting point for next exercises and thinking further what we can do in this space. And as researchers, but certainly, as often mentioned in this webinar, in collaboration with people with lived experience and members of the research ethics committees to try to improve our research. I hope we will be able to do it. So that would be my
Excellent, thank
word.
you. So the final message from both Hayley and Carl actually is this is just the beginning, not the end of the webinar.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you all. Thanks to all of the panel members. Thank you to Carl and Carolina and Leonard as well. And also again to Simon and Joel. Onward and upward. I'm going to go and clean up my kitchen sink. Thank you, everybody. Thanks again, panel members.